The day began like any other at Lake Meriden, a wide stretch of fresh water tucked between pine-covered hills that drew families every summer. The air was warm but not oppressive, the surface of the water calm and glassy, broken only by the occasional ripple from passing boats. For the Nelson family, it was meant to be a small adventure, nothing more than a pleasant afternoon outing during a weekend trip. Mark and Dana Nelson, both in their mid-30s, had rented a motorboat from the marina, hoping to give their two children, 8-year-old Grace and 6-year-old Liam, something fun to remember. It was the kind of day that seemed too ordinary to carry any hint of tragedy. Staff at the marina remembered them well. They stood out not because they did anything unusual, but because of how normal they were. Dana carried a small cooler, packed with sandwiches and snacks. Mark had been careful with the rental paperwork, double-checking the safety requirements before leading his kids down the dock. Grace wore a bright yellow life vest that looked slightly too big for her, while Liam clutched a small plastic toy boat he insisted on bringing along. Witnesses said the children looked excited, the parents relaxed. Around noon, the family untied the boat and slowly eased it out onto the lake, the motor's hum fading as they disappeared into the distance. Others out on the water recalled catching glimpses of them that afternoon. A couple fishing near the far side of the lake noticed the family waving cheerfully as they passed. A group of teenagers tubing behind a ski boat remembered hearing children's laughter echoing faintly across the water. Everything about the Nelsons' trip appeared unremarkable, even idyllic. No one reported distress, no one recalled danger. The boat moved steadily, keeping within the lake's usual traffic paths. For hours, it seemed like just another family enjoying a summer day. By late afternoon, however, small details began to stir unease. The marina staff were accustomed to families returning boats by a certain window. Most day rentals ended around 5 o'clock, giving workers time to refuel, clean, and prepare the vessels for the next morning. When the Nelsons did not reappear by 6, there was mild irritation, but not alarm. It wasn't unusual for renters to lose track of time. Staff assumed the family had simply chosen to enjoy the calm evening light on the water. By 7, the mood shifted. The boat should have returned, and phone calls to the family's listed number went unanswered. Dana's parents, who were expecting the family back for dinner, grew worried when no one showed. They drove to the marina themselves, thinking perhaps the outing had been extended. Instead, they found only unanswered questions and a staff already uneasy. By 8, with the sun dropping and shadows stretching across the lake, tension deepened. The last ferries from the far shore arrived without incident, but none carried the Nelsons. Marina workers scanned the docks repeatedly, convinced they must have missed the boat slipping in. Another worker drove the perimeter roads to check if they had pulled ashore at a secondary ramp. There was no trace. The lake was silent, except for the usual evening sounds of insects and the occasional splash of a fish. The Nelson family had vanished as though the water had swallowed them whole. By 9, the realization set in that this was no simple delay. The marina called local authorities, reporting the boat overdue. Deputies arrived, speaking first with staff, then with the grandparents. Together, they pieced together the timeline. The Nelsons had left shortly after noon, had last been seen between 1 and 2 o'clock, and should have returned by 5. Hours had passed with no sign of them, and darkness was now descending. Deputies began scanning the water from shore with spotlights, their beams cutting across the surface in wide arcs. Still, nothing appeared. On land, relatives clung to hope that the family had simply docked elsewhere, maybe even taken shelter with strangers after a minor mishap. But those hopes felt thin in the cooling night air. The Nelsons were not experienced boaters, but neither were they reckless. Mark had been cautious, attentive. Dana was protective of the children. No one believed they would disappear voluntarily, nor drift carelessly for hours without making contact. The first night ended with unanswered calls echoing into voicemail, unanswered questions stacking up against the silence of the lake. The water, which had seemed so open and harmless in the daylight, now loomed as a dark and uncertain expanse. Deputies promised that at first light, a full search would begin. The grandparents, sitting on the dock as midnight passed, struggled with the unthinkable. Only hours earlier, they had watched their daughter and son-in-law guide their grandchildren down this same pier, laughing and waving as the little motorboat pulled away. Now, There was nothing left but empty slips, still water, and the creeping dread that something had gone terribly wrong. When dawn broke, the marina was crowded with uniformed officers, search boats, and concerned onlookers. The first official reports marked the Nelson family as missing, their boat still unaccounted for. What had begun as a sunny afternoon on the lake was already shifting into something darker, a mystery that would pull investigators, divers, and the entire community into its depths. And beneath that calm surface, something was waiting to be found. By the time the last sliver of daylight faded from the lake, the unease at the marina could no longer be dismissed. The Nelson family had not returned, and what had first been shrugged off as a late-evening joyride was now something else entirely. Staff members, growing anxious, placed the call to the county sheriff's office just after 9 o'clock, reporting a boat overdue with a family of 4 aboard. Within minutes, the incident shifted from an annoyance to an official missing persons case. Deputies arrived at the marina in pairs, their patrol car's headlights throwing stark beams across the empty docks. They began with the basics, gathering statements, confirming rental times, logging every detail. Witnesses were asked when they last saw the Nelsons' boat and in what direction it was headed. Some gave vague recollections of a white vessel drifting near the South Basin around mid-afternoon. Others thought they might have spotted it closer to the northern cliffs. None of the accounts aligned with certainty, leaving investigators with little more than a blurred memory of where the family had been. The first hours of any disappearance are crucial, and deputies wasted none. They initiated shoreline sweeps, driving the perimeter roads, scanning beaches and rocky coves with spotlights. The lake stretched over 8 square miles, its irregular inlets and wooded banks offering countless places for a stranded boat to hide. Searchers expected at any moment to find the vessel pulled against a bank, its passengers perhaps stranded with engine trouble. But each turn of the shoreline revealed only still water and darkened trees. Back at the marina office, dispatchers dialed the family's phones repeatedly. Mark's number rang twice before going to voicemail. Dana's phone connected longer, but no one picked up. Calls to Grace and Liam's small tablets, which the grandparents confirmed were packed with them, went unanswered as well. A trace request with the cellular provider showed the last pings earlier that afternoon, near the center of the lake. After that, nothing. Investigators checked nearby campgrounds and private docks, hoping the family had simply tied up elsewhere, maybe visiting strangers who offered help. But no one reported seeing them. Rangers patrolled the trails bordering the lake, shining flashlights into picnic areas, calling their names into the night. It was as though the Nelsons had vanished without a sound, without a trace. For deputies, the silence was unsettling. Boating accidents, though rare on Meriden, followed certain patterns. A capsized vessel left debris, life jackets, coolers, paddles, floating on the surface. Engines that failed usually left a boat adrift, visible even in dim light. When tragedies occurred, distress calls were logged, even partial ones. But in this case, there had been nothing. No radio communication, no emergency signal, no fragments on the water. It was a blank space where evidence should have been. As the hours dragged into early morning, investigators faced 2 conflicting realities. Either the family was somewhere on that lake, alive but stranded, or something more serious had occurred out on the water without anyone noticing. Deputies leaned heavily toward the first explanation. It was easier to believe the Nelsons were huddled together, waiting for sunrise, their boat anchored in a hidden cove. It was harder to accept that 4 people could disappear from a crowded summer lake in the middle of the day without a sound. The grandparents refused to leave. They sat wrapped in light jackets near the marina office, watching deputies move with growing urgency. Every time headlights swept the parking lot, they looked up, expecting their daughter and grandchildren to appear. When officers explained the absence of evidence, the grandparents shook their heads. Dana, they insisted, was cautious to a fault. Mark, too careful to let his children out of sight. Something about the situation made no sense to them. By 3 a.m, boats equipped with searchlights began sweeping the water itself. Deputies maneuvered slowly, crisscrossing the southern basin, but visibility was limited to what the beams could cut through. The lake, calm by day, seemed immense and impenetrable by night. Even trained rescuers admitted frustration. The silence, the lack of clues, left them moving through darkness with little more than instinct. The search paused briefly at dawn, not for lack of urgency, but to regroup. Authorities wanted daylight, helicopters were requested, sonar equipment arranged, families were asked to provide recent photos of the Nelsons. What had begun with a routine phone call to report a boat overdue had now escalated into a full-scale emergency operation. The mood at the marina reflected the shift. What had been mild irritation at a late return was now grief sharpening into fear. Locals whispered theories. Perhaps the engine failed, perhaps they drifted toward the dam, perhaps they had gotten lost in one of the northern coves. Each suggestion seemed plausible, yet none explained why no trace had surfaced. The unanswered questions gnawed at everyone. Why had their phones gone silent? Why no floating debris? Why had no one seen them return toward shore? As the first rays of sunlight touched the surface of the lake, investigators prepared to widen their search. The Nelsons had set out on the water only hours earlier, in full view of dozens of witnesses. Now, as morning broke, it was as if they had never been there at all. At first light, Lake Meriden stirred with more activity than it had seen all summer. The sheriff's department, joined by state search and rescue teams, mobilized quickly. By 6 in the morning, the calm surface of the lake was cut by patrol boats, their engines growling as crews fanned out in careful formation. Helicopters circled overhead, their rotors sending ripples across the water, scanning for any sign of movement or wreckage. The air was heavy with a sense of urgency that pressed down on everyone gathered along the docks. The Nelson family had been missing for nearly 18 hours, and every passing minute eroded the fragile hope of finding them safe. Rescue teams knew the critical window was closing. Survivors of boating accidents could sometimes last through the night if clinging to debris. But as the morning wore on, the odds diminished. The focus now was on speed and precision. Divers were deployed to the lake's central basin, the deepest and most treacherous section where sudden cross-currents often pulled small vessels into trouble. They dropped into the cold water with flashlights strapped to their gear, disappearing beneath the surface where visibility stretched no more than a few feet. Down there, the lake was not the serene retreat known to families and vacationers. It was dark, murky, and full of obstacles that made navigation slow and exhausting. On shore, the Nelsons' relatives gathered quietly, refusing to leave despite the long night behind them. Friends from their hometown arrived as word spread, standing shoulder to shoulder with neighbors who had only met the family in passing. The scene took on the somber weight of a vigil. Parents clutched photographs showing them to officers as if the images alone could bring their loved ones back. Dana's mother, her hands trembling, insisted her daughter would have found a way to keep the children safe. Mark's brother walked the docks endlessly, scanning the horizon as though sheer willpower might conjure a sign. The first discoveries came just before noon. A rescue boat spotted a brightly colored life vest bobbing near the south end of the lake. Minutes later, another vest was found, drifting several hundred yards away. The items were quickly collected, logged, and confirmed to belong to the rental boat inventory. Not far from them, a small blue cooler floated lazily, its lid missing, contents gone. These pieces offered the first physical link to the Nelsons' outing, yet they raised more questions than they answered. There were no signs of capsizing, no overturned hull, no debris field that would suggest a violent accident. The objects seemed isolated, almost placed rather than scattered by a sudden mishap. Investigators were unsettled by the absence of the boat itself. Typically, even when tragedy struck on the water, vessels were found either floating damaged or sunk within a detectable range. Sonar sweeps of the central basin revealed nothing resembling a hull. Helicopter crews scanning from above found no trace along the shoreline or shallow coves. It was as though the boat had slipped beyond reach, leaving behind only fragments. The discovery of the life vests introduced another layer of unease. Accidents usually forced passengers into the water, but there was no evidence the family had been wearing the vests when they disappeared. Witnesses recalled seeing the children buckled in earlier in the day, yet the ones retrieved were adult-sized. Had they been discarded deliberately, torn off in panic, or placed in the water after the fact? Each theory carried disturbing implications. As the afternoon dragged on, frustration mounted among the crews. Hours of methodical searching had yielded only 3 items, none conclusive. Divers returned to shore chilled and exhausted, reporting endless walls of silt that swallowed visibility. Helicopters rotated out to refuel, their crews restless at the lack of progress. For family members watching, every boat returning empty was another blow to fragile hope. By early evening, the command post erected near the marina was cluttered with maps, sonar printouts, and checklists, yet no clear picture of what had happened. Investigators considered expanding the search beyond the lake itself. Could the family have somehow made it ashore unnoticed? Teams were sent into the surrounding woods, combing trails and campsites again. But like the night before, no signs of the Nelsons appeared. What unnerved authorities most was the vanishing of the boat. Without it, there was no anchor to the timeline, no clue to reconstruct what went wrong. Boats do not simply disappear, they sink, they drift, they wash ashore. They are found. The absence of one left investigators with a hollow mystery. As darkness began to creep back over the water, the rescue operation reluctantly scaled down for the night. Some boats remained on rotation, their lights sweeping across the lake's surface like restless eyes. Families clustered together, clinging to one another against the chill. Officials promised they would return at dawn, armed with more equipment, more divers, more determination. But beneath the official language of strategy and procedure lingered something harder to admit. The search was already strange. A family of 4 had set out across a popular, heavily trafficked lake in broad daylight. Hours later, all that remained were 2 drifting life vests and a cooler. No boat, no debris, no family. It was a detail that gnawed at investigators and haunted the relatives who waited on the dock. The lake had given back scraps, just enough to prove the Nelsons had been there. But the most important piece, the vessel itself, was missing, and with it, any clear explanation of what had unfolded on the water that day. As the second full day of searching ended without answers, investigators shifted their focus from the water to the timeline. If they could not yet recover the Nelsons, perhaps they could at least reconstruct their final hours. Detectives began pulling every scrap of surveillance footage, every witness statement, every digital record that might pinpoint where the family had been after leaving the marina. What they found began to erode the simple theory of a boating accident. The clearest evidence came from a gas station on the north side of the lake. Security cameras captured the rental boat pulling up to the fueling dock around 12:40 p.m. Mark Nelson was seen stepping out, securing the boat while Dana guided the children onto the shaded pier. He chatted briefly with the attendant, paid for the fuel, and then reboarded. The footage showed the family laughing as they untied the boat and motored back into open water. That was the last verified sighting of them. Detectives scoured cameras positioned at other marinas, public ramps, and shoreline businesses. If the Nelsons had returned by any of those routes, there should have been video proof. But no such footage existed. The family's boat appeared to have left and never returned, as though the lake itself had erased them from its memory. Witness interviews complicated the picture further. Several boaters recalled seeing a small vessel carrying 2 adults and 2 children during the early afternoon hours, but none could definitively identify the Nelsons. Accounts conflicted. Some claimed the boat was heading toward the rocky northern cliffs around 2 o'clock. Others swore they saw it cutting south near the shallow coves. None of these statements aligned closely enough to build a reliable map. More troubling were rumors that began filtering in from other visitors on the water. A pair of fishermen told deputies they heard voices carrying across the lake around 3 o'clock. The sounds were faint, distorted by distance, but they described them as raised. Maybe an argument, maybe cries for help. The men admitted they could not locate the source, nor could they say for certain whether it came from a single boat or 2. Another witness, a kayaker near the western reeds, also reported hearing what she described as shouting, echoing faintly. Yet again, the direction was unclear. These reports unsettled detectives. Arguments on the water were not uncommon during busy summer days, but combined with the missing family, they took on a darker weight. Could the Nelsons have encountered another group leading to a confrontation? Could raised voices have been their final attempt to call for help? Even the timeline of when items were discovered raised eyebrows. The cooler and life vests located during the first official search appeared unusually clean, not weathered as one might expect if they had been floating since the afternoon. Investigators wondered whether they had been placed later, drifting into detection only after time had passed. But if that were true, by whom? And why? Dana's parents provided one more troubling detail. They had exchanged text messages with her just after 1 o'clock. Dana wrote that the children were having the best time and sent a picture of Grace leaning over the boat's edge. When forensic analysts checked the phone company records, those messages aligned with a cell tower ping at the lake's center. But no communication came after that. It was as if the family's phones all went dark at once, somewhere around mid-afternoon. This silence cut against the accident theory. In typical emergencies, someone managed to get a call through, even a brief one, even a garbled signal. Here, nothing. Not a word. Investigators began to suspect deliberate interference, though whether from mechanical failure, sabotage, or something more sinister was unclear. By the third day, detectives were openly questioning the simple accident narrative in their briefings. The inconsistencies were mounting: a family vanishing without distress signals, belongings appearing without the boat, witness reports of shouting no one could pinpoint. Each piece stood alone as explainable. Together, they formed a pattern that felt less like misfortune and more like intrusion. For the relatives camped at the marina, these revelations deepened the torment. If it had been an accident, there would at least be closure in tragedy. But talk of raised voices and missing footage suggested something darker, that perhaps the Nelsons had not only vanished but had been taken from the safety of their summer afternoon by another hand. Deputies expanded interviews, pressing anyone who had been on the water that day to come forward again. Boats were checked for scratches or signs of collision. Marinas were asked to review logs for unfamiliar rentals. Still, nothing definitive surfaced. It was as though the lake was withholding the truth, offering fragments just out of reach. By the close of that day, investigators admitted privately that the narrative no longer held. A boating accident could explain debris. It could explain a sinking. But it could not explain a boat that left and never returned, voices overheard but never located, and a timeline filled with contradictions. Something else had happened on Lake Meriden, something the pieces of evidence only hinted at, but refused to fully reveal. And then, 3 days later, the case took another turn, when the missing boat finally resurfaced. On the morning of the third day, just as the search effort seemed to be stalling under the weight of unanswered questions, a call came in from a private boater. He had been fishing along the eastern inlets when he noticed something adrift near a shaded cove, partially hidden beneath overhanging trees. At first, he thought it was just another empty vessel left untied. But as he drew closer, the sight chilled him. It was the missing rental boat rocking gently against the current, its paint scuffed but otherwise intact. Authorities scrambled to the scene. Deputies boarded quickly, documenting the discovery with photographs before stepping inside. What they found inside the boat deepened the mystery rather than solving it. The interior was strangely untouched, as though the Nelsons had stepped away only moments earlier. Dana's tote bag lay near the bow, unzipped, containing sunscreen and a folded towel. The children's half-eaten snacks were still on the seats, wrappers fluttering faintly in the breeze. 2 cell phones rested side by side in the cup holders. Everything suggested an outing interrupted midstream, except for the family themselves, who were nowhere to be found. Investigators cataloged each item meticulously. The children's sandals were discovered beneath a bench. A pair of sunglasses was balanced on the console. Even a paperback book marked halfway through lay open-faced on the deck. There were no signs of a struggle. No broken glass, no blood, no overturned seating. It looked less like an accident and more like a sudden, deliberate departure. But there were odd details. The ignition key was missing, though the boat's controls showed no signs of damage. Typically, in accidental sinkings or abandonments, keys were still in place. Here, it was as though someone had intentionally removed them. Even stranger, a marine mechanic called in to examine the vessel noted tampering along the fuel line. The hose bore fresh tool marks, the kind left when clamps were loosened and reattached. To experts, this meant either someone had tried to repair the boat in haste, or someone had deliberately interfered with it. For investigators, this shifted the narrative dramatically. An accident no longer seemed like the most logical explanation. Instead, they began to entertain the possibility that the Nelsons' disappearance was not a tragedy of misfortune, but of design. The location of the discovery only added weight to the suspicion. The cove where the boat was found was far from the central basin where search teams had concentrated. It was quiet, secluded, and shielded from the main channels. To reach it required navigating narrow passages few casual boaters explored. Why would the family drift miles from their expected path into a near-hidden stretch of shoreline? Detectives revisited the timeline with this new information. If the family's last confirmed location was near the fueling dock on the north side of the lake and the boat turned up abandoned in the eastern cove, days later, someone must have guided it there. The wind and currents alone could not have carried it so precisely, especially with its bow caught against the underbrush as if intentionally tucked away. The personal belongings on board only fueled speculation. Why were phones left behind? Why not a single attempt to call for help, even if something forced them from the boat? Analysts powered them on and found the last activity frozen at early afternoon on the day of the disappearance. Neither phone had been used since. Grace's small tablet, zipped into Dana's tote, told the same story. Whatever happened, it had silenced the family swiftly. For the Nelsons' relatives, news of the boat's recovery brought fleeting hope, quickly replaced by horror. They gathered near the marina as the vessel was towed back across the lake, their faces fixed on the empty deck. Seeing the family's things, the snacks, the towels, the phones, was like staring into a snapshot of ordinary life interrupted. But the absence of the people those objects belonged to only magnified the sense of loss. It was proof that the family had been there, living and breathing only days ago, yet it was also proof they had vanished into nothingness. Speculation spread rapidly through the community. Some believed the family had staged their disappearance, though those who knew them dismissed the idea outright. Others whispered about foul play, pointing to the tampered fuel line and the missing key as signs of deliberate sabotage. Theories circulated about a second boat, one perhaps seen shadowing them earlier in the day, that could have intercepted them. Investigators now faced a darker, more complex puzzle. If the Nelsons had suffered a tragic accident, the boat should have provided answers. Instead, it raised more questions than ever. The missing key, the mechanical tampering, the oddly pristine belongings, each detail hinted at human involvement. As deputies secured the boat under evidence tarps, one investigator remarked quietly that it looked less like a vessel that had been abandoned and more like a vessel that had been returned. It was as though someone had wanted it to be found, stripped of its passengers, stripped of its answers, but left floating as a cruel reminder. The recovery of the boat shifted the tone of the entire case. No longer was this a simple disappearance on the water. It was beginning to look like a crime, one carried out in broad daylight on a lake full of witnesses without leaving a trace of who was responsible. And as detectives turned their attention to suspects and possible motives, the theories only grew darker. In the days that followed the discovery of the Nelsons' empty boat, speculation spread faster than official reports ever could. The case that began as a feared accident had morphed into something darker, and with each passing day without answers, theories multiplied in the silence left behind. For the public, it was easier to construct explanations than to accept the impossible, that 4 people could vanish in broad daylight without trace. One of the earliest theories was that Mark Nelson had staged an escape. Rumors circulated about financial trouble, about debts that might have pushed him to disappear with his family rather than face them. Anonymous callers phoned the sheriff's tip line, insisting Mark had been acting strange in the weeks before the trip, though none could provide specific examples. Investigators dug into his accounts, his business records, and his credit history. What they found showed ordinary stresses, bills, a mortgage, expenses for 2 young children, but nothing remotely resembling the kind of desperation that would justify such a theory. His friends and co-workers rejected the idea outright. Mark, they said, was stable, dependable, a man devoted to his family. Attention shifted then to Dana. Some speculated she had been unhappy, that perhaps she had sought escape. Detectives interviewed her friends, co-workers, even her book club. Every account painted the same picture. Dinah was content with her life, protective of her children, meticulous in her routines. Nothing suggested she would vanish willingly, and certainly not drag her children into danger. As theories about the parents faltered, whispers turned outward. Several locals told deputies they remembered seeing another boat moving unusually close to the Nelsons that afternoon. It wasn't uncommon for boaters to pass near each other on crowded summer weekends, but some insisted this one lingered, shadowing at a distance. Descriptions were inconsistent. Some said it was a dark fishing boat, others a lighter ski vessel. No registration numbers were reported, no photographs taken. By the time investigators canvassed marinas for unusual rentals or unfamiliar vessels, too much time had passed. Any suspicious boaters had long since gone. Still, the possibility of another boat raised disturbing implications. If the Nelsons had been intercepted, could they have been forced off their own vessel? Could someone have taken them away before returning the boat to the cove where it was later found? Deputies considered the idea, but without clear witness confirmation, it was little more than conjecture. Theories grew wilder as weeks passed without progress. Some speculated about strangers with grudges, about chance encounters with dangerous individuals visiting the lake that weekend. Others resurrected old stories of unsolved crimes in the region, trying to link them to the Nelsons' case. Every rumor, no matter how far-fetched, was passed around town, fueling both fear and fascination. Investigators, meanwhile, followed every credible lead they could. They interviewed dozens of boaters and campers, cross-checked alibis, even traced purchases of fuel and supplies from lakeside stores. They combed through Mark and Dana's phone records, Dinah's work emails, Mark's business contacts. Nothing surfaced that pointed to enemies, threats, or secret lives. The family appeared exactly as they seemed, ordinary people who had vanished under extraordinary circumstances. As days stretched into weeks, the case began to lose momentum. Media crews that had swarmed the marina during the first frantic searches packed up and left. Search boats were recalled, divers reassigned. The sheriff's office admitted in press briefings that no new evidence had surfaced, their tone softening from urgency to cautious resignation. For the Nelsons' relatives, it was unbearable. To watch the case they lived in every moment slowly cool in the public eye. But even as the investigation stalled, small details gnawed at detectives. The missing ignition key, the tampered fuel line, the possibility of another boat, none fit neatly into the picture of an accident. To experienced investigators, the silence of the lake felt less like absence and more like concealment. Something, they believed, was still hidden. And then, when the case seemed destined to fade into unsolved obscurity, divers searching near the town's main pier made a discovery. The pier had been combed during the initial days, but currents and debris often concealed objects in its shadow. On a late afternoon dive, one of the sonar operators flagged something unusual wedged between the pilings, an irregular shape where only silt and timbers should have been. As divers descended, the water turned dark, visibility narrowing to inches. They felt along the supports, their hands brushing against something foreign tangled in the debris. When they pulled it free and rose back to the surface, the entire tone of the investigation shifted once again. It wasn't the boat. It wasn't more scattered debris. It was something far more chilling, and it would leave everyone stunned. The town's oldest pier had stood for nearly a century, its thick wooden pylons driven deep into the lake bed, weathered by generations of fishermen and vacationers. Children had leapt from its railings into the shallows every summer. Tourists bought ice cream cones at the small shack nearby, and boaters tied up briefly to refuel or stretch their legs. It was one of the busiest and most visible spots on the lake, a place no one ever imagined could be hiding something unthinkable beneath its surface. When sonar operators first noticed the irregular shape wedged under the pier's decking, most assumed it was scrap metal or sunken debris. Old fishing nets, discarded lumber, even rusted shopping carts had been pulled from those waters over the years. But as divers slipped into the water to investigate, their beams of light revealed something far more unsettling. Tangled among branches and silt were scraps of fabric, discolored and frayed but still recognizable as clothing. Nearby, half buried in the muck, was the pale curve of bone. The divers surfaced slowly, their faces grim. Without fanfare, they signaled for the recovery unit. Within hours, the pier was cordoned off, police tape fluttering in the summer breeze as families and tourists were pushed back from the boardwalk. Word spread almost instantly. Something had been found. Forensic teams worked methodically, hauling up one piece at a time. First came sections of cloth, a floral pattern later identified as Dana's sundress, fragments of denim believed to be Mark's shorts. Then came smaller, haunting details. A child's sneaker, faded but intact, its laces knotted. A life vest strap. And finally, confirmed by bone specialists on site, human remains. The lake had finally given something back, but it wasn't the kind of discovery anyone had hoped for. The recovery stretched into the night, floodlights glaring across the water as technicians sifted through muck and debris. Every item was photographed, bagged, logged. By morning, the medical examiner confirmed what many already feared. The remains belonged to the Nelson family. Tests would later match DNA samples provided by the grandparents, sealing the identification. After weeks of uncertainty, the question of whether the family had survived was answered, but the circumstances of their discovery only deepened the mystery. From the beginning, investigators were struck by the location. The pier was shallow, less than 12 feet of water beneath its deck, constantly stirred by boat traffic. It was not an area where bodies would naturally drift or settle. More importantly, it was one of the most visible parts of the lake. For weeks, deputies and volunteers had scoured those very waters with boats, helicopters, and divers. How could the family have been there all along, hidden beneath one of the busiest structures on the lake without anyone noticing? The placement suggested something deliberate. Forensics noted that some of the fabric and bone fragments had been wedged tightly between the pylons, caught under layers of silt and debris as though pressed there intentionally. Analysts struggled to reconcile the evidence with the idea of a drifting accident. If the Nelsons had fallen into the water mid-lake, currents might have carried them, but not so precisely into the tight crawl space beneath the pier. Someone, it seemed, had placed them there. This implication chilled the community. The pier had been a place of laughter and gathering, yet for weeks, as families walked across its boards, the remains of the Nelsons lay directly below, hidden just out of sight. Locals struggled with the realization that every ice cream cone eaten, every summer photo snapped, had unfolded above a concealed grave. Investigators now treated the site as a crime scene. They combed the planks and railings for signs of tampering, checked security cameras mounted at nearby businesses, and interviewed workers who staffed the pier's fuel dock. Yet none recalled seeing anything suspicious, no late-night boat slipping into the shadows, no unusual movements beneath the decking. Whoever had placed the remains there had done so without attracting attention, despite the pier being one of the most public locations on the lake. The discovery also reignited witness statements about shouting heard on the water that afternoon. Could the confrontation have ended near the pier itself? Could another boat have met the Nelsons there, forcing them from their vessel before discarding the evidence beneath the structure? The idea seemed plausible, but frustratingly, no one could confirm it. For the family's relatives, the confirmation of death brought both heartbreak and unbearable new questions. Closure was no comfort when it came with the knowledge that someone had likely hidden their loved ones deliberately. Dana's mother broke down when shown the small sneaker retrieved from the water. Mark's brother demanded answers at a press briefing, insisting authorities admit that this was no accident. Their grief now carried a sharper edge, not just loss, but suspicion. The sheriff's office acknowledged the disturbing implications, but stopped short of labeling it homicide. Official statements referred to the case as suspicious pending further investigation. Behind closed doors, however, detectives admitted what the evidence suggested. The Nelsons had not simply drowned, they had been silenced, and someone had gone to great lengths to conceal them. As word of the pier discovery spread, the community's perception of the case shifted permanently. No longer did people debate whether it was an accident or a mistake. The conversation turned instead to darker possibilities. Who had the motive? Who had the opportunity? And perhaps most unsettling, how had they managed to do it in plain sight? The pier had given up its secret, but with it came the realization that the truth of what happened to the Nelsons was far more disturbing than anyone had feared. and the forensic revelations that followed would only make the picture darker still. The medical examiner's findings brought the case into an entirely new and chilling realm. For weeks, speculation had circled around the possibility of accident versus foul play, but the autopsies of the remains recovered beneath the pier left little doubt. These deaths were not the result of misfortune on the water. They were deliberate. Tests confirmed what investigators had quietly suspected. The fractures along Mark Nelson's skull and ribs were not consistent with drowning or impact from debris. They were the result of blunt force trauma, repeated and violent. Dana's remains showed similar injuries, defensive fractures along her forearms, breaks that suggested she had raised her arms against something heavy. These were the marks of assault, not accident. The children's remains were even more disturbing. Both Grace and Liam showed bone compression around the wrists and ankles, subtle indicators of restraint. Analysts explained that these injuries formed when bindings held a person tightly, cutting against bone as they struggled. To investigators, the implication was clear. The children had been tied. The details stunned even seasoned detectives. It was one thing to imagine an accident on the water, or even a targeted attack against the parents. It was another to realize that whoever was responsible had chosen to restrain two young children before ending their lives. With these revelations, the investigation shifted into the realm of homicide. Press briefings were no longer cautious or vague. Officials confirmed the family had been killed. Reporters pressed for details, but the sheriff's office revealed little beyond the fact that the deaths were suspicious and consistent with foul play. The broader public was left to fill in the silence with rumor and fear. Behind the scenes, detectives revisited every lead with renewed urgency. The sighting of a second boat, once dismissed as anecdotal, now loomed large. Witnesses were re-interviewed, their statements scrutinized for consistency. Could this unidentified vessel have intercepted the Nelsons, forcing them to abandon their boat? The location of the remains beneath the pier suggested concealment rather than chance. Investigators believed the second boat theory might explain how the family had been transported and disposed of so close to shore without detection. Old case files were also reopened. Detectives looked for patterns of violence in the region, unsolved disappearances, boating incidents, or assaults that might connect. A few cold cases bore similarities, but none provided a clear link. Still, the possibility lingered that the Nelsons were not the first victims, only the most visible. Attention also turned inward, toward Mark's business dealings. He had worked as a contractor, juggling multiple jobs, sometimes under pressure from clients and partners. Financial records showed disputes over payments, late invoices, and at least one contentious lawsuit involving a subcontractor. Investigators considered whether an angry associate might have harbored a grudge strong enough to escalate into violence. Interviews were conducted with former clients and business contacts, but while tempers and disagreements were noted, nothing stood out as motive for murder. The more detectives probed, the less sense the case made. The Nelsons had no enemies that anyone could name, no ties to criminal activity, no history of conflict that matched the brutality of what had happened. Yet the facts were irrefutable. They had been beaten, restrained, and hidden. Forensic revelations reframed the entire investigation, but they also deepened the enigma. Who could have carried out such an act in broad daylight on a crowded lake? How had they avoided detection while concealing the family beneath one of the most public structures in town? And why target a family that by every account lived quiet, ordinary lives? These questions echoed through the sheriff's office as detectives pushed forward. The lake had given back evidence of murder, but not the identity of the murderer. The Nelsons' deaths were no longer considered an accident, no longer even a mystery of disappearance. They were confirmed victims of homicide. And as investigators pursued the few remaining leads, the case began to feel less like a solvable crime and more like something darker, a haunting that refused to reveal its culprit. The forensic revelations should have propelled the case toward resolution, but instead, they seemed to push it further into shadow. Detectives clung to the strongest lead, the mysterious second boat reportedly seen near the Nelsons that afternoon. They canvassed every marina within 50 miles, checking rental logs, fuel purchases, even casual dock slips. Nothing matched. No registration numbers surfaced, no renters came forward. If another boat had been there, it vanished as cleanly as the family themselves once had. Witness statements, once promising, unraveled under scrutiny. The fishermen who swore they heard shouting now disagreed on the time. One placed it near 3 o'clock, another closer to 4. A kayaker who reported seeing a vessel shadowing the Nelsons admitted she couldn't be certain it wasn't just a boat traveling in the same channel. With each retelling, details blurred, timelines stretched. What had seemed like threads of truth frayed into contradictions. Detectives pursued Mark Nelson's business connections, hoping a financial dispute might expose motive. Old invoices and lawsuits were pulled, interviews conducted with disgruntled subcontractors and former clients. While tempers and accusations surfaced, none contained evidence that could be tied to violence. Dana's personal life was examined too, but yielded the same result. No secret affairs, no threats, no hidden conflicts. For all the digging, investigators found only the portrait of an ordinary family caught in extraordinary circumstances. The water itself had erased much of what might have told the story. Bones degraded, clothing deteriorated, DNA washed away by weeks beneath silt and current. The fuel line tampering could not be traced to any tool or hand. The missing ignition key was never recovered. Every physical clue stopped short of pointing to someone. Forensic certainty about homicide clashed with the impossibility of naming a killer. By late summer, the investigation lost momentum. The sheriff's office, once flooded with tips and national media attention, saw its call volume drop. Detectives rotated to other cases, leaving only a small team assigned. Press briefings became shorter, their language softer. Words like ongoing and open replaced the urgency of active. For the Nelsons' relatives, it was a quiet betrayal, a signal that the case which consumed them was slipping into cold status. The pier itself transformed in the public's imagination. What had once been a landmark for tourists now carried a weight of dread. Locals began leaving flowers there, setting candles along its railings, turning it into an informal memorial. Parents warned children not to play beneath it, whispering that the lake had secrets. Rumors persisted that the pier creaked at night. The divers swore they felt unseen currents dragging at their legs. Whether superstition or trauma, the place became a living reminder of what was lost and what remained hidden. For investigators, it was the most frustrating truth of all. They knew the Nelsons had been murdered, but they could not prove by whom or why or how the crime had unfolded in such a public place without a single witness stepping forward with clarity. Leads had not only run dry, they had evaporated, leaving behind nothing but speculation and grief. Years have passed since the Nelson family vanished on that summer afternoon, but the case remains officially open and painfully unsolved. The sheriff's office still lists it as active, though no new evidence has surfaced in years. Files gather dust, leads are re-examined only to collapse, and detectives rotate in and out of the assignment, each adding notes that ultimately circle back to the same questions. On paper, it is a case suspended in limbo. For the families who lost Mark, Dana, Grace, and Liam, it is a wound that refuses to close. The pier where their remains were found has become a place of quiet pilgrimage. Every year, on the anniversary of their disappearance, flowers appear on its railing. Bouquets are weighted with stones to keep them from blowing into the water, children's drawings are tucked into the slats, candles flicker at dusk. Some are left by family, others by strangers who never knew the Nelsons but cannot shake the story. Tourists still visit, but they linger with hushed tones now, aware they are walking above what became, in effect, a grave. Divers who assisted in the recovery still speak about the site with unease. They describe the strange stillness beneath the pier, the way silt clouds the water and settles again, as if concealing more than anyone has yet touched. Some believe additional objects remain down there, fragments of clothing, tools, perhaps even the missing ignition key, buried too deeply to retrieve without dismantling the entire structure. But each dive costs money and manpower, and with the case already stagnant, new searches have not been authorized in years. The lake, it seems, still guards its secrets. In the absence of progress, theories have hardened into legend. Some insist the Nelsons were victims of chance, that a confrontation with strangers spiraled into violence. Others are convinced it was personal, tied to a grudge in Mark's business dealings, an act meant to punish not only him, but his entire family. More chilling are those who whisper about a predator on the lake, someone who knew its currents, its shadows, and its hiding places well enough to execute a crime in broad daylight. No theory has ever been proven. The legacy of the case has reshaped how locals view the water. For many, Lake Meriden is no longer a place of carefree summers, but a reminder of how fragile safety can be. Parents keep children closer to shore, reluctant to let them wander too far on paddleboards or small boats. Rental companies now enforce stricter policies, but the unease lingers, unspoken yet present. It is as though the lake itself has been marked, not by myth or superstition, but by the knowledge that it once swallowed an entire family without a trace. For investigators who worked the case, the frustration endures. They know what happened in the broadest sense. The Nelsons were killed. The evidence proved blunt force trauma, restraint, concealment, but the how, the why, and most importantly, the who remain missing pieces. Detectives revisit the files occasionally, hoping fresh eyes might catch what others missed. Each time they return to the same haunting detail. The family's bodies were not lost in the deep basin of the lake, but hidden beneath the town's most public pier. It was placement, not accident. Someone put them there. That fact remains the most chilling. The pier was a place of constant traffic, in full view of tourists, workers, and residents. Whoever carried out the act chose concealment in plain sight, betting, correctly, that no one would look beneath the surface long enough to see what lay just a few feet away. For investigators, it suggests boldness, familiarity, and a disturbing confidence. The act was not random chaos, it was calculated. The Nelsons' relatives live with that knowledge daily. Dinah's parents, now elderly, still visit the pier, touching the weathered railing as though it connects them to their daughter. Mark's brother maintains a small website dedicated to the family, updating it every year with the same plea, that someone, somewhere, knows more than they've admitted. Yet no one has ever come forward. Silence has hardened around the case, as immovable as the silt that still clings beneath the pier. In the end, what remains is a chilling legacy. In a crowded lake, on a sunny afternoon, an entire family was erased. No violent storm, no catastrophic accident, just the quiet efficiency of something, or someone, removing them from their lives. What little returned was filtered through water and time, stripped of clarity, leaving only fragments to haunt those left behind. And so the question lingers, unresolved and unanswerable. Who put them there?